The confidence expressed by German general staff officers rested upon decades of accumulated military science and practical battlefield experience. Wehrmacht doctrine, systematically refined through successful campaigns in Poland, France, and the vast expanses of Russia, stated with categorical certainty that motorized divisions absolutely required railway infrastructure support for any operational advance exceeding 150 kilometers distance. The entire German military organizational structure had been built upon this foundational principle that they considered an iron law of logistics. Every single German division operating in France during this period still employed approximately 5,000 horses working alongside their motorized vehicles. Even the celebrated panzer divisions that had astonished the world with their rapid victories in 1940 never conducted sustained operations more than 200 kilometers distant from functioning railway supply terminals. The Wehrmacht supply apparatus remained fundamentally unchanged in its essential characteristics since the Great War, maintaining dependency on railroad networks vulnerable to aerial bombardment, horses requiring constant fodder supplies, and vehicles demanding dozens of distinct categories of spare components. German staff officers had written extensively in professional military journals about how American forces faced identical constraints that limited every modern military force. They reasoned that Americans might possess greater numbers of trucks than German forces, but wheeled transport could never replace railroad systems for strategic-level movement of supplies. The fuel consumption mathematics alone rendered extended truck-based logistics impossible. A truck carrying fuel necessarily consumed fuel during the delivery process, creating an inescapable mathematical equation. The Americans would inevitably reach their culmination point within days of outrunning their railway infrastructure support. This analytical framework had proven accurate in every major campaign conducted since 1914. German planners saw absolutely no reason to believe the current situation would demonstrate any different outcome. However, the Americans were preparing to demonstrate something that the German military intellectual framework simply could not conceptualize. They were not merely going to extend their existing logistics arrangements to breaking point. They were going to completely reinvent military supply operations from fundamental principles. What German logisticians failed to comprehend was that American industrial production capacity had achieved levels that rendered their meticulous calculations completely obsolete. Where German supply planners thought in terms of scarcity management and efficiency optimization, American planners approached problems with concepts of overwhelming abundance and decisive material superiority. Private James Rucard, merely 19 years of age and originally from Maple Heights, Ohio, climbed into the driver's compartment of his GMC CCKW cargo truck at 4 o'clock in the morning on the 25th of August. Before being drafted into military service, he had never operated anything larger than his uncle's pickup truck. Now he found himself assigned to the 3,846th Quartermaster Truck Company, one of 67 companies initially designated for an operation so urgently conceived that it had not yet even received an official designation or name. The operational briefing these drivers received had been remarkably simple, yet conveyed undeniable urgency. They were to drive with maximum speed, deliver their assigned cargo, and return immediately for subsequent loads. They were not to stop for any circumstances whatsoever. The lieutenant conducting the briefing had looked these young men directly in their eyes when emphasizing that final instruction, making absolutely certain they understood. When he stated they should not stop for anything, he meant precisely that. If a truck experienced mechanical failure, the driver should immediately transfer to another vehicle. If they encountered German forces, they should maintain their forward movement. The operation would cease for nothing. What Ruckert and approximately 23,000 other drivers did not fully understand at that moment was that they were about to systematically disprove every German calculation regarding logistics constraints. They were about to demonstrate conclusively that with sufficient numbers of trucks, adequate fuel supplies, and unwavering determination, a military force could advance faster and cover greater distances than established military science declared possible. Brigadier General Ewart Planck, who bore responsibility for implementing the convoy system that would sustain this operation, made a declaration that would subsequently echo through military historical analysis for generations. He stated with absolute determination that history must never record that insufficient supplies stopped General Patton's advance when German military forces could not. The sheer scope and scale of what American planners were attempting completely defied German comprehension and understanding. The Wehrmacht, even during its peak operational efficiency throughout the 1940 invasion of France, had never successfully sustained more than 300 trucks operating continuously on any single supply route. The Americans were preparing to deploy 6,000 vehicles in non-stop operations, running continuously 24 hours daily, 7 days weekly. Wehrmacht intelligence officers, conducting observations from concealed positions near Chartres, counted 140 trucks passing during a single hour. When these numerical counts were reported through channels to division-level commanders, they were dismissed outright as gross exaggerations or possibly the product of alcohol-induced hallucinations. German commanders simply could not accept that any military force possessed such quantities of vehicles. The notion was completely impossible to credit. German observers stationed in hidden positions continued counting until they literally exhausted their numerical capacity to track individual vehicles. During one particular hour, they successfully logged 140 separate vehicles. When they transmitted these observations to their division commanders through official channels, they faced accusations of exaggerating numbers or consuming alcohol while on duty. The commanders insisted such figures were impossible to believe. The entire Wehrmacht across all theatres of operation did not possess that many trucks in functional operational condition at any given time. Yet the counts these observers were reporting were entirely accurate, and they represented less than 3% of the total Red Ball fleet that American logistics officers had assembled. The Americans had accomplished something German military planners considered fundamentally impossible. They had completely motorized their supply system from beginning to end, entirely eliminating railway infrastructure from the logistical equation. While German quartermasters still performed their calculations in terms of hay quantities for horse fodder and coal tonnage for locomotive fuel, American supply planners conceptualized requirements in terms of octane ratings and tire replacement schedules. The contrast between these two military logistics philosophies was not merely a quantitative difference in available resources, but represented two fundamentally different conceptual approaches to warfare itself. The trucks themselves that Americans deployed provided a revelation to German observers who examined them. The GMC CCKW vehicles, commonly known as deuce and a half trucks, along with Dodge WC series vehicles, were not individually superior in design or capability to comparable German trucks. The Opel Blitz vehicles that Wehrmacht quartermasters employed, when they could actually obtain them, were arguably more sophisticated in their engineering. However, the Americans had standardized their entire fleet to a degree that absolutely stunned German mechanics who had opportunities to examine captured vehicles in detail. Every single truck in American service used completely interchangeable components. Within Wehrmacht motor pools, there existed 12 fundamentally different types of vehicles requiring 47 distinct categories of spare parts inventories. The Americans had essentially reduced everything to one vehicle type, requiring one standardized set of replacement parts. The implications of this standardization approach for maintenance operations and vehicle repair were absolutely staggering in their significance. The standardization philosophy extended far beyond merely the trucks themselves. The Americans had standardized absolutely everything connected with their logistics operations. Fuel containers, tire specifications, tool sets, even the driver training curriculum itself followed standardized procedures. Any driver who had learned to operate one truck could immediately transition to operating any other truck in the entire fleet. Any mechanic capable of repairing one vehicle could repair any vehicle. Spare parts cannibalized from one broken truck could maintain 5 additional trucks in operational condition. This represented mass production industrial principles applied directly to military logistics operations, and the effectiveness proved devastating in its practical results. The operational speed of this supply system completely shattered German tactical planning assumptions. Wehrmacht doctrine operated on the assumption that Allied forces, like German forces themselves, would need to pause operations every 150 to 200 kilometers to consolidate supply lines and establish new forward supply depots. These necessary pauses would provide defending forces with critical time to reorganize formations and establish new defensive positions. However, the Americans simply never stopped their advance. The trucks maintained continuous movement, and consequently, American tanks continued their forward momentum without pause. The situation appeared as though normal laws of military physics somehow did not apply to American forces. The drivers operating within the Red Ball Express system themselves became inadvertent psychological weapons deployed against German military morale. 75% of these drivers were African American soldiers, men whom Nazi racial ideology classified as inherently inferior beings incapable of mastering technical tasks or operating complex machinery. German soldiers captured during September 1944 subsequently provided testimony during interrogations about their experiences watching these endless convoys passing their positions. They explained that Nazi propaganda had consistently taught them that American military forces would inevitably collapse because their mongrel army included Negro soldiers incapable of mastering mechanical equipment. Yet confronting them was undeniable evidence of thousands of these supposedly inferior men operating complex vehicles in perfect convoy formations, maintaining speeds that German forces could not achieve even with their best-trained drivers. The realization emerged that everything they had been taught represented systematic lies. The sight of black soldiers demonstrating obvious skill and technical precision, operating sophisticated equipment, generated profound cognitive dissonance among German troops. Nazi ideological teachings held that racial mixing weakened military forces, that only racially pure organizations could achieve true military excellence. Yet here existed concrete evidence that directly contradicted every lesson they had absorbed. The psychological impact proved profound and disturbing. If the racial theories they had been taught were demonstrably wrong, what other aspects of Nazi ideology might also be lies? Corporal Charles Johnson of the 783 Military Police Battalion stood at a critical road junction, directing the seemingly endless flow of trucks. During 12 hours of duty, he would direct more vehicles through this single intersection than most German cities witnessed during an entire month. The military police had created simple directional signs marked with a distinctive red ball symbol painted on white backgrounds. No other vehicles of any kind were permitted to use these designated routes. French civilian vehicles were turned away at checkpoints. Even general officers travelling in staff cars had to locate alternate routes if their destinations required using Red Ball routes. The roads belonged exclusively to the Red Ball Express operation, and absolutely nothing was permitted to slow the continuous flow of supply trucks. The organizational precision Americans demonstrated amazed German observers who monitored these operations. Every truck bore identification numbers. Every driver carried specific written instructions. Loading points, unloading points, refueling facilities, maintenance areas were all precisely coordinated through centralized planning. This represented American industrial management principles applied directly to warfare operations, and the system functioned with an efficiency level that German staff officers could only fantasize about achieving within their own logistics systems. The psychological impact on German intelligence analysts proved devastating to morale. Wehrmacht analysts conducting detailed studies of American logistics networks for Army Group B submitted formal reports on September 2nd that bordered on expressing panic. Their written assessments stated that American supply systems operated at levels previously considered impossible. The Americans were delivering 12,000 tons of supplies daily using exclusively truck transport. This tonnage exceeded the carrying capacity of most railway networks in Europe. If these figures represented accurate data, and field observations consistently confirmed their accuracy, then Wehrmacht analysts had to conclude they had fundamentally misunderstood the true scale of American industrial capacity. The numbers German intelligence cited were not merely accurate, but actually conservative estimates. On August 29th, the Red Ball Express achieved its peak single-day delivery performance, 12,342 tons of supplies transported by 5,958 individual vehicles. To establish proper perspective on these figures, the entire German Army Group B, defending against the Allied advance, received less than 2,000 tons of supplies daily through their combined railway and road transportation network. The disparity between these logistics capacities was not simply significant, it represented overwhelming material superiority. General der Panzertruppe Heinrich Eberbach, commanding Panzer Group West, recorded thoughts in his personal diary shortly before his capture in late August, expressing his growing despair. He wrote that German forces were fighting an enemy who appeared to possess unlimited quantities of everything: unlimited trucks, unlimited fuel, unlimited capacity to sustain continuous operations. He questioned how military commanders could possibly develop effective tactics against an enemy who completely ignored the logistical constraints that bound every other military force. German planners developed strategies based on calculating when American forces should exhaust their supplies, but the supplies never ran out. He compared the experience to fighting against the ocean itself. German confusion deepened considerably as they observed American refueling operations in action. Wehrmacht trucks, during those rare occasions when fuel was actually available, were refueled using hand-operated pumps drawing from 200-litre drums, a laborious process that could require an entire hour to refuel a single company of vehicles. Staff Sergeant William Edwards of the 3639 Quartermaster Truck Company described their radically different method during a post-war interview. He explained that American convoys would arrive at fuel dumps with 20 or 30 trucks simultaneously. The fuel dumps operated pumps identical in concept to civilian filling stations back in America, except substantially larger in capacity. 5 minutes maximum, and trucks were fully fueled and rolling again toward their destinations. German observers watching these operations must have believed they were witnessing some form of magic or trickery. The reality was not magic, but industrial standardization implemented on a scale German logistics had never achieved. Americans employed purpose-built fuel transport trucks equipped with power takeoff pumps capable of delivering 50 gallons per minute. Germans were still employing modified civilian fuel trucks that managed perhaps 10 gallons per minute when their hand-operated pumps functioned properly. German observers filed reports to their commanders explaining that Americans refueled an entire company of trucks faster than Wehrmacht logistics could refuel a single platoon. The efficiency demonstrated was industrial rather than military in character. Americans had transformed warfare operations into factory production procedures. The German High Command's response to these reports revealed their complete inability to comprehend what they were confronting. On September 5th, Field Marshal Walter Model issued orders to all subordinate units stating that reports describing American truck convoys exceeding 1,000 vehicles daily represented obvious exaggerations and should be disregarded as enemy propaganda designed to undermine morale. Units spreading such allegedly defeatist rumors would face severe disciplinary action. However, Model's own staff officers knew the absolute truth. His chief logistics officer had personally observed the convoys with his own eyes and wrote in private correspondence that Model refused to believe what every staff officer could plainly see with their own observation. The Americans had rendered Germany's entire conceptual framework for warfare completely obsolete. They did not capture territory and then consolidate their positions. They captured territory and immediately continued advancing because their supplies never ceased flowing forward. The maintenance system supporting Red Ball Express operations provided yet another profound shock to German military observers. Captain Otto Skorzeny, Hitler's personal commando specialist who had been specifically tasked with disrupting American supply lines, conducted reconnaissance that revealed something that stunned even this experienced special operations officer. Every 50 miles along American supply routes, they had established maintenance stations. These were not major depot facilities, merely mechanics equipped with parts, inventories, and tools. When a truck experienced mechanical breakdown, mechanics repaired it immediately at roadside or pushed it off the road, and the driver simply transferred to another passing truck. In the German military system, a broken vehicle meant a lost cargo delivery. In the American system, only the truck itself was lost, never the cargo load or the driver. Americans had positioned 300 mobile maintenance trucks along Red Ball routes, each vehicle capable of performing major mechanical repairs. They carried welding equipment, machine tools, and extensive quantities of spare parts inventories. Private First Class Robert Williams, an African-American mechanic assigned to the 894th Ordnance Company, subsequently recalled the intensity of their maintenance work. He described trucks arriving with blown engines, shattered transmissions, axles bent from chronic overloading. In the United States, these would represent depot-level repairs requiring weeks of workshop time. American mechanics were completing these repairs in hours, sometimes performing them directly on the roadside. If they could not complete repairs within 30 minutes, they would drag the disabled vehicle off the road and cannibalize it for spare parts to maintain other trucks. The Germans, in stark contrast, were still sending damaged vehicles back to factory facilities located in Germany for major repairs. A damaged half-track vehicle might spend 3 weeks in transit and repair. Americans were returning vehicles to operational service in 3 hours. Major Rudolf Lehmann of the 12th SS Panzer Division wrote expressing his frustration at the futility of attacking American convoys. He described how German forces would destroy 10 American trucks in a carefully planned ambush. Within 2 hours, the cargo from those destroyed trucks had been transferred to replacement vehicles and was moving again toward its destination. The drivers his unit captured were new personnel they had never encountered before. Americans seemed to possess unlimited reserves of both equipment and trained personnel. The human dimension of Red Ball Express operations delivered perhaps the most psychologically devastating blow to Nazi ideological foundations. Here were African-American soldiers, men whom Nazi racial theory classified as Untermensch or subhumans incapable of operating complex machinery, maintaining the most sophisticated logistics operation in military history, with remarkable skill and precision. Technical Sergeant Edward Sheffield of the 514th Quartermaster Truck Regiment had been the son of an Alabama sharecropper before entering military service. Now he commanded a platoon of 40 trucks, coordinating their movements with the precision normally associated with orchestral conductors. In an interview conducted in 1995, he recalled that all the drivers understood their work mattered tremendously. Every gallon of gasoline they delivered meant General Patton's tanks could advance another mile closer to Berlin. Every box of ammunition they transported meant American combat troops could continue fighting. They were not merely driving trucks in their own estimation, they were actively winning the war. By September 10th, Patton's Third Army had advanced 400 miles from the Normandy invasion beaches. German military doctrine stated categorically that such an advance represented a logistical impossibility without railway infrastructure support. The furthest distance the Wehrmacht had ever sustained an offensive from fixed supply bases was 300 miles during their invasion of France in 1940, and that advance had required capturing French fuel depot facilities. The Americans were accomplishing this entirely with truck transport, carrying everything they required from the beaches hundreds of miles behind the front lines. General Hermann Balck, commanding German Army Group G, convened an emergency staff meeting on September 12th. His operations officer, Oberst Friedrich von Mellenthin, documented the discussion in meticulous detail. Balck demanded explanations for how Americans were sustaining their advance. When informed about the scale of truck convoy operations, he exploded in furious rage, declaring it mathematically impossible. He insisted no military force could consume 800,000 gallons of fuel daily and transport it 400 miles using truck convoys. The fuel required to move the fuel would consume the entire transport capacity. The mathematics rendered it a physical impossibility. Yet the impossible was happening before their eyes. Americans were not merely maintaining Patton's advance, but actually accelerating its pace. The secret lay in something Germans never fully grasped: industrial-scale efficiency applied to military operations. Every single aspect of Red Ball Express operations had been optimized for maximum efficiency. The designated routes were one-way only, completely eliminating delays caused by two-way traffic congestion. Trucks operated with their engine governors removed, reaching speeds of 60 miles per hour instead of the regulation 35 miles per hour. Military police were stationed every few miles with instructions to immediately push broken-down vehicles off roadways, preventing traffic jams from developing. Loading and unloading operations were performed by specialized teams who could completely clear a truck cargo in 15 minutes instead of the hour typically required. Master Sergeant John Bass of the 582 Quartermaster Company described their loading process in detail. They had refined it to pure science. Trucks would arrive and drivers would not even shut off engines. One team was already positioned with forklift equipment, another team with hand trucks. 15 minutes maximum, usually only 10 minutes, and trucks were rolling again toward their destinations. Germans were still unloading cargo by hand, one individual box at a time. Americans were moving entire pallets of supplies. The palletization system alone revolutionized military logistics operations in ways German quartermasters could barely comprehend. Germans still loaded individual boxes, barrels, and miscellaneous containers, each item requiring separate handling. Americans had standardized wooden pallet systems that could be loaded using forklift equipment in mere seconds. German officers who studied captured American supply dumps wrote reports expressing amazement. One American soldier operating a forklift could move more cargo tonnage in 1 hour than an entire company of German soldiers could move by hand labor in a full day. This was not superior individual soldiering. This represented superior systems design and implementation. The convoy system operated with relentless mechanical efficiency. Trucks were individually numbered and systematically tracked. If truck number 342 departed Cherbourg at 8 o'clock in the morning carrying 2.5 tons of ammunition, logistics officers knew precisely when it should arrive at Chartres. If that specific truck failed to appear on schedule, military police patrols would immediately begin searching for it. Germans observing this precision coordination could not understand how it was managed without massive bureaucratic overhead. They observed that Americans managed thousands of vehicles with less paperwork than Wehrmacht required for managing a company. American efficiency seemed to defy possibility, yet Germans witnessed it functioning successfully every single hour of every single day. The fuel consumption that German planners insisted would inevitably stop the American advance never materialized as an actual constraint on operations. Americans had solved the mathematical equation through sheer volume overwhelming the problem. Yes, trucks consumed enormous quantities of fuel to transport fuel, but Americans simply provided more trucks and more fuel. When German calculations demonstrated Americans would need 500 trucks to maintain operations, Americans provided 5,000 trucks instead. Major General Otto Heidkemper, Chief of Staff for German Army Group B, admitted during post-war interrogation that Wehrmacht planners kept calculating when Americans would reach their culmination point, when the sheer weight of their logistics would force them to halt operations. German planners never understood that Americans possessed industrial capacity to simply overwhelm any problem with unlimited resources. Where Germans would carefully husband every liter of fuel, Americans would simply provide another 1,000 trucks carrying more fuel to eliminate scarcity. The German attempts to interdict Red Ball Express operations revealed the full extent of their fundamental miscalculation about American capabilities. The Luftwaffe, reduced to a mere shadow of its former strength, could barely manage 100 combat sorties per day over France. When German aircraft did successfully attack convoys, the results proved minimal. The columns stretched so far that destroying even a dozen trucks barely affected overall operations. Oberleutnant Heinrich Hartmann, flying one of the few remaining Focke-Wulf 190 fighter aircraft, described his experience attacking a Red Ball convoy. He made 3 strafing passes, destroying perhaps 5 trucks. As he climbed away from the attack, he could observe hundreds more trucks still moving forward. Attacking the convoy felt like attacking an anthill with a pin. No matter how many individual trucks you destroyed, more kept coming endlessly. Americans had anticipated air attacks and planned their operations accordingly. Trucks maintained 60-yard spacing intervals, limiting the damage any single air attack could inflict. Quad 50 caliber anti-aircraft guns were stationed along the routes. Most importantly, the sheer redundancy built into the system meant that losses were immediately absorbed without affecting delivery schedules. Captain Frank Percival of the 146th Quartermaster Truck Company remembered German air attacks as more annoyance than serious threat. Certainly German aircraft would destroy some trucks, but Americans had so many trucks operating that individual losses did not matter significantly. They would push burning wrecks off the roadway and maintain forward movement. Cargo from destroyed trucks would be transferred onto other trucks within an hour. By mid-September, Red Ball Express had transported over 200,000 tons of supplies. German Army Group B had received less than 30,000 tons during the same period through their entire logistics network combining rail and road transport. The disparity was so enormous that German commanders began refusing to believe their own intelligence reporting. General von Zangen, commanding the 15th Army, accused his intelligence officer of spreading defeatist propaganda when presented with estimates of American supply capacity. He questioned whether these numbers could possibly be accurate. Was his intelligence officer claiming Americans moved in one day what German forces moved in an entire week? Either the sources were wrong or the intelligence officer had been listening to enemy propaganda broadcasts. Yet the evidence was overwhelming and completely undeniable. German units were capturing American supply dumps that contained more material than entire German divisions possessed in total. When a German regiment overran a small American fuel depot, they discovered 10,000 gallons of gasoline casually stored in an open field. This was merely a minor depot, one Americans had not even considered worth defending properly. Yet it contained more fuel than the German regiment had seen in 6 months of operations. They burned what they could not transport, but the German officers knew then they were fighting an enemy whose resources were effectively infinite for practical purposes. The psychological impact extended beyond simple material superiority. Red Ball Express operations demonstrated American organizational capability that directly contradicted Nazi propaganda about democratic weakness and inefficiency. German prisoners captured in September 1944 told their interrogators consistent stories. They had been taught that democracy made people soft and disorganized, that only authoritarian discipline could achieve military efficiency. But the American supply system functioned with precision that exceeded anything in the Wehrmacht. American soldiers seemed to understand their assigned tasks without being constantly screamed at by officers. They worked with evident purpose rather than from fear of punishment. The drivers themselves became legendary figures among both American and German forces. They drove for 54 continuous hours, catching brief naps while their co-drivers took over wheel control. They navigated bomb-cratered roads in complete blackout conditions, their only illumination the minimal cat-eye blackout lights that provided barely enough visibility to follow the road ahead. They pushed their trucks beyond all recommended mechanical limits, running engines until they seized completely, then immediately jumping onto another truck to continue the mission without pause. Private Eugene Dixon of the 3916 Quartermaster Truck Company remembered the exhaustion in vivid detail. There were times he was so tired he experienced hallucinations, seeing things that were not actually there, but they maintained their forward movement. They knew soldiers were dying at the front lines, waiting for supplies they carried. Sleep could wait until the mission was complete. Germans observing this dedication could not reconcile it with their ideological beliefs about racial inferiority. SS Sturmbannführer Joachim Peiper, whose unit would subsequently perpetrate the Malmedy massacre during the Battle of the Bulge, wrote in a September 1944 report that Negro drivers displayed commitment that contradicted Nazi racial theories. They drove with evident skill and courage, maintaining their vehicles with obvious expertise. He noted that the implications for Nazi ideology were profound, but could not be openly discussed without risking severe punishment. The maintenance statistics alone told a story that stunned German quartermasters when they analyzed American operations. Despite running vehicles 20 hours per day at speeds that should have destroyed them mechanically, Americans maintained an 85% operational readiness rate. German units babying their precious vehicles rarely exceeded 60% readiness. The secret lay in preventive maintenance and complete standardization. Every Red Bull truck received a 10-point inspection check every single time it stopped for any reason. Oil levels, water levels, tire pressure, brake fluid were all checked and topped off in minutes. German mechanics who examined captured Red Bull trucks expressed amazement. These vehicles had been driven like racing cars for weeks, yet they remained in better mechanical condition than German trucks that barely moved. Americans must perform maintenance constantly, at levels Germans only achieved in major depot facilities. American drivers had developed their own culture and improvised methods that maximized operational efficiency. They removed engine governors to increase maximum speed, modified carburetors for better fuel flow, and reinforced suspensions with unauthorized field modifications. When officers attempted to enforce regulations, drivers simply ignored them. Colonel Charles Lanham, commanding elements of Red Bull Express, admitted after the war that officially he was supposed to court-martial drivers for removing governors. Unofficially, he told his officers to look the other way. These men were winning the war 2.5 tons at a time. If they needed to break some technical rules to accomplish this, then he was content to let them do so. Germans tried desperately to understand and counter Red Bull Express operations. Special commando units were tasked with mining the routes, but the sheer volume of traffic meant that even successful attacks barely slowed operations. A destroyed bridge would be replaced by American engineers in hours, sometimes using prefabricated Bailey Bridge sections that convoys carried for precisely this purpose. Major Wolfgang Schenk, tasked with interdicting American supply lines, reported in frustration that German efforts were futile. They would mine a road. Americans cleared it in 2 hours. They would destroy a bridge. Americans built another overnight. They would ambush a convoy and 10 more convoys would pass while they were still engaging the first. It was not fighting a military force. It felt like fighting a force of nature itself. Red Bull Express transformed more than just logistics operations. It revolutionized fundamental military thinking about what was possible in modern warfare. The German General Staff had spent decades perfecting the relationship between operations and logistics, calculating precise ratios of advance distance to supply capacity. Americans simply threw away the traditional calculations and overwhelmed the problem with industrial might. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, admitted during his post-war interrogation that Germans thought in terms of efficiency, of accomplishing more with less resources. Americans thought in terms of abundance, of accomplishing everything with overwhelming resources. German staff officers could not comprehend this approach because it violated everything they knew about military science. By late September 1944, Red Bull Express had delivered over 300,000 tons of supplies. Patton's Third Army had advanced further and faster than any military force in recorded history, covering 600 miles in 40 days. German commanders were no longer debating when the American advance would culminate. They were desperately trying to understand how it had not already halted. Wehrmacht staff officers wrote in their assessment reports that they faced an enemy who had made their entire concept of warfare obsolete. Americans did not pause to consolidate positions because they never ran out of supplies, never ran out of fuel. They had transformed logistics from a constraint into an offensive weapon system. The impact on German military morale was catastrophic. Soldiers who had been taught they were the master race fighting with superior aerial efficiency watched as African-American drivers maintained a logistics miracle that the Wehrmacht could never hope to duplicate. The question began circulating among German troops. If Americans could train their Negroes to accomplish this feat, what did that imply about everything they had been told? Were they actually the superior race, or had they simply been systematically lied to about everything? French civilians watched in amazement as the convoys thundered through their villages day and night without pause. Marie Dubois, a school teacher in Dreux, maintained a diary throughout the occupation and liberation. She recorded that Germans had come through their village with horses and wagons, taking days to pass completely. Americans came with endless trucks that never stopped, never slowed their pace. In 1 hour, more American trucks passed than German vehicles had during an entire month of occupation. The noise never ceased, engines roaring day and night continuously. It was the sound of liberation itself. The drivers faced constant danger beyond German military attacks. The roads, already damaged by combat, were being pulverized by constant heavy traffic. Trucks overturned on destroyed road shoulders. Drivers fell asleep at the wheel, crashing into ditches. The accident rate was statistically significant, but the convoys never stopped moving. Private William Clark of the 3418 Quartermaster Truck Company survived 3 separate rollovers during his service with Red Ball Express. The first time, he was scared to death. The third time, he simply climbed out, grabbed his rifle, and flagged down the next truck. They all knew the situation. The supplies had to get through to the front. Everything else was secondary to that mission. In October 1944, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt ordered a comprehensive study of American logistics capabilities. The report, completed just before the Battle of the Bulge offensive, was a masterpiece of military analysis that reached a devastating conclusion. American logistics systems operated at levels that German doctrine declared impossible. They sustained operations at distances and speeds that exceeded German theoretical maximum by factors of 3 or 4. German analysts had to conclude either that their entire understanding of military logistics was fundamentally wrong, or that Americans possessed industrial and organizational capabilities beyond German comprehension. In either case, the implications for the war's ultimate outcome were absolutely clear. The report was immediately classified and hidden from most German commanders, deemed too demoralizing to distribute widely, but those who read it understood its profound significance. Americans had not just outproduced Germany. They had revolutionized warfare itself. Future wars would no longer be won by the side with the best tactics or the bravest soldiers, but by whichever side could deliver the most material to the point of contact. General Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the Wehrmacht High Command, wrote in his prison cell after the war that Germans understood combined arms warfare, the integration of tanks and aircraft and infantry into coordinated operations. What Germans never understood was that Americans had added a 4th dimension, logistics as a weapon system itself. Red Ball Express was not supporting the war effort. Red Ball Express was the war itself in many respects. The statistics, when finally compiled after the war concluded, were staggering to comprehend. In 83 days of operation, Red Ball Express delivered 412,193 tons of supplies. The trucks travelled over 122 million ton miles. Over 40,000 tyres were worn completely out. The operation consumed 300,000 gallons of lubricating oil and 40 million gallons of gasoline. At peak operations, a truck passed any given point on the route every 14 seconds, 24 hours daily. German staff officers studying these numbers after the war simply could not reconcile them with their operational experience. General Major Friedrich von Mellenthin wrote in his memoir that Red Ball Express moved more tonnage than most national railway systems. They accomplished this with trucks alone, over demolished roads, under active combat conditions. It remains the most impressive logistics achievement in military history. The human cost was significant, but far less than conventional military operations would have incurred. Approximately 300 drivers died during Red Ball Express operations, mostly from accidents and exhaustion-related crashes. German attempts to interdict the convoys resulted in fewer than 50 combat deaths. Germans lost more personnel trying to stop the convoys than Americans lost operating them. Major Heinrich Böll, who would later become a Nobel Prize-winning author, observed Red Ball Express as a Wehrmacht artillery observer. He wrote that Germans could have killed more American drivers, certainly. But what would have been the point? For every truck they destroyed, 10 more appeared. For every driver they killed, another took his place. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 represented Germany's final major offensive operation in the West. The operation was predicated on capturing American fuel supplies, as German logistics could not provide adequate fuel for the attacking forces. SS Obersturmbannführer Jochen Peiper, leading the spearhead of the German offensive, had been explicitly promised captured American fuel depots to sustain his advance. When his units overran a depot near Stavelot, they found it already destroyed by retreating Americans. In his interrogation after capture, Peiper stated bitterly that Americans could afford to burn more fuel than Germans could capture. The depot they needed contained 2.5 million gallons. Americans destroyed it rather than allow Germans to capture it. Only a nation with unlimited resources could make such a decision. Red Ball Express drivers returned to their regular units or were reassigned to other supply operations. Many would continue driving trucks through the end of the war, sustaining the Allied advance into Germany itself. They received little formal recognition at the time. The segregated army structure meant that African American soldiers, regardless of their contributions, were relegated to second-class status. It would be decades before their achievement received proper acknowledgement. But German military professionals knew exactly what had happened. General Franz Halder, former chief of the German General Staff, wrote in his post-war analysis that Red Ball Express proved that in modern war, logistics is not merely a support function but a decisive weapon. Americans understood this principle, Germans did not. While Germans were fighting the previous war relying on railways and horses, Americans were fighting the next war where industrial capacity and organizational efficiency would determine victory. Technical Sergeant James Bailey, an African-American driver with the 3628 Quartermaster Truck Company, reflected years later on what they had accomplished. They told them they were just truck drivers, not real soldiers. But they knew better. Every mile they drove, every ton they delivered brought the war closer to ending. They were not shooting at Germans, but they were beating them just the same. Germans had the best trained army perhaps, but Americans had something better. They had Detroit putting out trucks faster than anyone could count, oil fields in Texas pumping out unlimited fuel, and boys from Alabama and Mississippi who could drive anything with wheels through any conditions imaginable. Germans never had a chance against that combination. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, one of Germany's most capable commanders, admitted after the war what Red Ball Express had demonstrated. Germans prided themselves on military efficiency, on accomplishing more with fewer resources. But in industrial warfare, the side that can accomplish more with more resources will always prevail. Germans had better soldiers, perhaps, maybe better generals, but Americans had unlimited trucks, unlimited fuel, unlimited everything. How do you defeat an enemy that can lose 100 trucks and not even notice the loss? General Oberst Heinz Guderian, the father of German armoured warfare, who had created the Blitzkrieg concept that revolutionized warfare in 1939 and 1940, provided perhaps the most telling assessment in his post-war memoirs. Germans invented fast-moving armoured warfare, but Americans perfected it. Germans could advance 200 kilometres and then had to stop for supplies. Americans advanced 600 kilometres and never stopped. The difference was not in tank quality. The difference was that behind every American tank were 100 trucks bringing fuel, ammunition, and food. Germans never understood that in modern war the truck is more important than the tank. The secret army that had fueled Patton's Blitz was not secret at all. It consisted of 23,000 American drivers, mostly African Americans, who drove through exhaustion, enemy fire, and impossible conditions to deliver 412,193 tons of supplies across 400 miles of war-torn France. They had turned logistics from a science of limitations into an art of possibilities. In 83 days, Red Ball Express had proven that in modern warfare, the nation with the most trucks and the determination to keep them rolling would inevitably prevail. German military doctrine that had conquered most of Europe between 1939 and 1941 had rested on careful calculations of what was logistically possible. Americans had simply refused to accept those limitations, throwing industrial might at the problem until it disappeared. Where German staff officers saw mathematical impossibilities, American logistics officers saw challenges to overcome with more trucks, more drivers, and more determination. Red Ball Express had not just supplied an army, it had shattered an entire military philosophy, proving that in the age of industrial warfare there were no limits except those imposed by imagination and will. The drivers of Red Ball Express had written their names into history, not with bullets, but with tyre tracks across the face of France, an indelible mark that stretched from the beaches of Normandy to the borders of Germany, testament to what American industrial might and human determination could achieve when combined in common purpose. They had proven that modern wars would not be won by the generals who best understood tactics, but by the nations that could best transform their industrial capacity into military power, delivering overwhelming material to the point of decision faster than any enemy could respond. The transformation was complete. In August 1944, German generals had dismissed the idea that trucks could replace trains in strategic military logistics. By November, those same generals were either dead, captured, or in retreat, their armies starved of supplies while Americans advanced with seemingly unlimited resources. Red Ball Express had not just supplied Patton's army, it had demonstrated a new reality of warfare that would define military conflict for generations to come. German generals had stopped laughing. They had witnessed something that their military science declared impossible. An army advancing 600 miles from its bases, supplied entirely by trucks, never pausing, never culminating, never running out of anything. They had seen the future of warfare, and it belonged to the nation that could produce the most trucks and train the most drivers to keep them rolling 24 hours daily. In conference rooms in Berlin, German staff officers tried desperately to understand what had happened. How had Americans sustained an advance that every calculation showed was impossible? The answer was simple and devastating. Americans had not accepted the constraints that limited other armies. They had simply produced more trucks, trained more drivers, and organized them with an efficiency that turned logistics from a military necessity into a strategic weapon. As the war moved into Germany itself in 1945, the lessons of Red Ball Express became even clearer. American forces advanced not because they were better fighters than Germans. Many would argue Wehrmacht remained tactically superior until the end. But American forces never ran out of supplies. Every American unit had more ammunition than it could shoot, more fuel than it could burn, more food than it could eat. The logistics system that Red Ball Express had pioneered ensured that American firepower could be brought to bear continuously, overwhelmingly, decisively. German soldiers captured in the final months of the war told consistent stories. They had run out of ammunition while Americans seemed to have unlimited supplies. They had run out of fuel while American tanks kept advancing. They had run out of food while American soldiers threw away rations they didn't like. The material superiority was so overwhelming that tactical excellence became irrelevant. What did it matter if German soldiers were better trained when American soldiers had 10 times the ammunition? Red Ball Express had proven something that military theorists would study for decades. In modern industrial warfare, logistics is not just a support function but the decisive factor. The side that can deliver the most material to the point of contact will win, regardless of tactical disadvantages. Americans had understood this truth and built their entire war effort around it. Germans, still thinking in terms of operational art and tactical excellence, had never grasped it until too late. After the war, German military professionals would study Red Ball Express as a masterclass in logistics. At the new German Staff College, American logistics methods became required study. Former Wehrmacht officers, now training the new West German Army, would emphasize again and again the lesson of 1944. Wars are won not on the battlefield, but in the supply depot, not by the general who can maneuver best, but by the one who never runs out of fuel. The drivers themselves, the men who had made it all possible, returned to an America that still treated them as second-class citizens despite their contributions. Segregation continued, discrimination persisted. But they had changed warfare forever. They had proven beyond any doubt that industrial capacity, properly organized and applied, could overcome any tactical disadvantage. They had demonstrated that in modern war, the humble truck driver is as important as the tank commander, perhaps more so. Behind the statistics, 412,193 tons of supplies, 122 million ton-miles, 40 million gallons of gasoline, was a human story of determination, ingenuity and courage that transformed modern warfare. The legacy of Red Ball Express extended far beyond World War II. In Korea, in Vietnam, in every American military operation since, the lessons learned on the roads of France in 1944 have been applied and reapplied. Logistics is not just important, it is decisive. The army that can keep its forces supplied will defeat the army that cannot, regardless of any other factors. The transformation that began on August 25, 1944, when the first Red Ball Express trucks rolled out of St. Lo, had changed warfare forever. German military leaders who had dismissed American trucks as inferior to their railway-based logistics system had witnessed the birth of a new kind of warfare, one where industrial capacity and organizational efficiency mattered more than all the military traditions and tactical excellence in the world. In the end, Red Ball Express was more than just a supply operation. It was a demonstration of American industrial might, organizational capability, and human determination that shattered every assumption about what was possible in warfare. The secret army that fueled Patton's Blitz had never been secret at all. It had operated in plain sight, its trucks thundering across France in endless convoys that German forces could see but couldn't stop, couldn't comprehend, couldn't counter. The psychological impact had been as devastating as the material effect. How do you maintain morale when the enemy has so many trucks they don't even bother to hide them? How do you plan operations when the enemy ignores the constraints that bind your own forces? These were the questions German commanders asked themselves as they watched Red Ball Express transform warfare before their eyes. They had no answers because they were trying to fight a new kind of war with old ideas. Americans had not just outproduced Germans, they had outthought them, recognizing that in modern industrial warfare, the side that can deliver the most material to the battlefield will win, must win, cannot help but win. Red Ball Express had proven this truth beyond any doubt. In 83 days, it had delivered victory not through brilliant tactics or heroic sacrifices, but through the simple, relentless application of industrial might to the problem of military logistics. German military leaders had learned too late that in modern warfare, logistics is strategy, supply is tactics, and the nation with the most trucks will defeat the nation with the best soldiers. It was not the war they had trained for, but it was the war they had to fight, and they had lost it on the roads of France where American trucks had rolled day and night, unstoppable and overwhelming, carrying the future itself. The transformation was complete and irreversible. Modern warfare had been forever changed by 23,000 drivers, most of them African Americans deemed inferior by Nazi ideology, who had proven that in industrial age conflict the truck was mightier than the tank, logistics more important than tactics, and determination to keep rolling more decisive than any battlefield maneuver. German generals who had laughed at American trucks in August 1944 had witnessed the birth of a new age of warfare, and they had been on the wrong side of history, outmatched not by superior soldiers but by superior systems, not by better tactics but by better logistics, not by military genius but by industrial might properly organized and relentlessly applied. That was the lesson of Red Ball Express, and it echoed through military history from that day forward, changing forever how wars would be fought and won.